Rebecca Morgan's finger tensed on the trigger. Below her, in the frigid dark of her own cabin, floorboards creaked. Boots she didn't recognize. Heavy boots. The sound of men who took what they wanted. She held her breath, the icy Montana air forming a small, ghost-like cloud in the loft. Beside her, the man lay still. So pale he was almost part of the snow outside. His shoulder, wrapped in a crude bandage, was a splash of crimson against the white cloth. He was a stranger, and he'd brought death to her door. She was sure of it. She counted the footsteps. Slow, deliberate. One man, then another. A third. At least three. Outside, the wind howled like a banshee, but it couldn't cover the sound of horses snorting, their breath steaming in the cold. These were not friendly visitors. Rebecca knew that in her bones. 2 years a widow in this unforgiving territory had taught her that much. Joseph was gone. The warmth of their life together had been ripped away by a barn fire they called an accident. Now all she had left was this small cabin, a few acres of stubborn land, and a hardness in her eyes that used to be as green and soft as spring wheat. The storm had started at dawn, a wall of churning white that swallowed the world. By noon she couldn't see the barn, just 30 yards away. It was inside that barn, just an hour ago, that she'd found him. The stranger, slumped against the wall, an arrow sticking out of his shoulder. His own horse lay dead beside him. "They're following," he'd rasped, his voice rough as splintered wood. His eyes, a startling blue, were wide with something more than pain. It was fear, a deep, primal fear. "Who?" she'd demanded, Joseph's old rifle steady in her hands. "Apache," he'd said, "and others." Then his eyes had rolled back, consciousness slipping away. But not before he whispered two words that changed everything. The boy. She hadn't understood. What boy? "Hidden," he'd gasped. "Find him." And she had, tucked into a snowdrift by the woodpile, nearly buried alive. A small, shivering form wrapped in a thin blanket. When she brushed the snow away, she saw his face. His hair was long and black. His features were delicate, sharp, an Apache child, miles from any reservation, in the heart of a blizzard, with a wounded white man who claimed his people were hunting them. Nothing made sense, but Rebecca had been a nurse during the war. She knew a dying man when she saw one, and she knew a child freezing to death. Questions could wait. Survival couldn't. She dragged the man from the barn, his dead weight a terrible burden in the blinding snow. She'd carried the boy, who weighed almost nothing at all. Now they were both in her cabin. The boy wrapped in blankets by the fire, his breathing shallow but steady. The man unconscious in the loft, his lifeblood seeping into her floorboards. And below, the men who were hunting them had arrived. Rebecca steadied the Winchester, resting its barrel in a gap between the loft planks. She wasn't the same woman Joseph had married. Grief and solitude had carved away her softness, leaving something harder, something more dangerous. She would not lose this home. She would not be another lonely grave marker swallowed by the Montana snow. The footsteps stopped directly below her, a low murmur of voices. Then a heavy fist pounded on her door, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent cabin. Rebecca's world narrowed to the sight of her rifle, the feel of the cold trigger, and the certain knowledge that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break inside her home. The pounding came again, harder this time, rattling the door in its frame. "Hello in there!" A man's voice called out, rough and impatient. "We know you're in there. We saw the smoke." Rebecca didn't move. She didn't breathe. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. 3 men at least. She had one rifle and a pistol Joseph kept in a drawer. The man in the loft was useless to her, maybe even a liability. The boy was a vulnerability she couldn't afford. Why had she brought them in? Joseph's voice echoed in her memory. "We don't leave folks to die, Becca. Not even when it's inconvenient." This was more than inconvenient. This was deadly. The front door shuddered as a heavy boot kicked it. The wood groaned, but the thick oak bar Joseph had installed held firm. "Don't make us burn you out, ma'am," the voice shouted. "We just want the man and the boy. Give them up, and we'll be on our way." "Give them up! Like they were property!" Like their lives meant nothing. Rebecca thought of the boy, his small body so cold, his eyes so old and full of fear. She thought of the stranger, running from a terror so great he'd ridden his horse to death. No, she couldn't do it. Whatever they had done, they didn't deserve to be handed over to men like these. She shifted her position, the floorboards groaning softly under her weight. A mistake. "She's in the loft!" A different voice yelled from below. A shot exploded, the bullet tearing through the floorboards just inches from her head, showering her with splinters. Rebecca flattened herself against the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. The element of surprise was gone. They knew where she was. Another shot ripped through the floor. They were firing blind, trying to flush her out. She had to do something. She had to fight back. Crawling on her belly, she moved toward the edge of the loft. The Winchester pushed ahead of her. She peered through the cracks. She could see two of them. Big men in heavy winter coats, their faces obscured by shadow and beard. One was reloading his pistol, the other held a rifle, his eyes scanning the loft ceiling. Where was the third? The wounded man beside her moaned, a low guttural sound. He was waking up. "Quiet," she hissed, pressing a hand over his mouth. His blue eyes fluttered open, confused at first, then sharpening with alarm as he heard the men below. "They found us," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Told you," he grimaced, trying to sit up. "Shouldn't have helped." "Too late for that," Rebecca snapped, her focus on the men below. "Can you shoot?" The man looked at his bandaged shoulder, then back at her. "With my left hand, maybe. Not well." Below, the men were getting bolder. One of them moved toward the ladder to the loft. "Come on out, little lady. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Rebecca's mind raced. The ladder was a choke point, her only advantage. She pushed the Winchester into the stranger's hands. "If he steps on that ladder, shoot him," she commanded. Before he could answer, she crawled to the other side of the loft, grabbing the old heavy trunk where she kept her spare linens. It was filled with Joseph's mother's quilts, heavy as lead. With a surge of adrenaline, she pushed it. The trunk tipped over the edge of the loft, crashing down onto the man with the rifle below. He let out a cry of pain and surprise as he was knocked off his feet, his rifle clattering across the floor. "Now!" Rebecca screamed. The stranger, Grant, fired the Winchester. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The man at the ladder grunted and stumbled back, clutching his leg. One down, one injured. But where was the third? The back door suddenly burst open. The third man stood there, a massive figure silhouetted against the swirling snow, a shotgun leveled not at the loft, but at the fireplace, at the small bundle of blankets where the boy was hiding. "Drop your weapons," he boomed, his voice a low growl, "or the boy dies first." Rebecca froze. She could see the boy, little Fox, peeking out from the blankets, his eyes wide with terror. The man with the shotgun took a step closer to the fire. It was an impossible choice, a checkmate. Her fight was over before it had even begun. She had failed them all. The man with the shotgun was a monster of a man, with a thick, tangled beard frosted with ice. His eyes were small and hard, like chips of granite. He gestured with the barrel of his shotgun. "I said drop him, now!" In the loft, Grant lowered the Winchester slowly. The metallic click as he set it on the floorboards echoed in the tense silence. Rebecca watched, her mind numb with disbelief. It couldn't end like this. The man on the floor, the one hit by the falling trunk, was stirring, groaning. The one Grant had shot in the leg was leaning against the wall, his face a mask of pain and fury. "Get the boy," the big man ordered him. The injured man limped toward the fireplace. Little Fox shrank back into the blankets, a small whimpering sound escaping his lips. Something inside Rebecca snapped. It was one thing to threaten her, a grown woman with a rifle. It was another thing to terrorize a child. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice low and dangerous. The big man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The lady's got spirit. Don't worry, we ain't gonna hurt him. Much. The colonel just wants to talk to him." Colonel. The name meant nothing to her, but it was spoken with a mix of reverence and fear. The man reached the fireplace, his hand reaching for little Fox. And in that instant, a blur of motion came from the shadows near the hearth. A small, dark shape launched itself at the man's injured leg. It was the boy. Little Fox, who had been silent and still as a stone, moved with the speed of a striking snake. He sank his teeth into the man's thigh, right into the gunshot wound. The man screamed a high-pitched shriek of agony and stumbled backward, trying to shake the boy off. The distraction was all they needed. Grant, moving with surprising speed for a wounded man, slid down the ladder. He ignored the man with the shotgun and slammed his good shoulder into the man nursing his head wound, sending him crashing into the wall. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy oil lamp from a small table in the loft and hurled it down. It shattered on the floor near the big man with the shotgun, splashing hot oil and flame across the dry wooden planks. Fire, the cabin's greatest fear, now her greatest weapon. The flames erupted, spreading with terrifying speed, creating a wall of fire between them and the man with the shotgun. He cursed and jumped back, shielding his face from the heat. "Get out!" Rebecca screamed at Grant, who was now wrestling with the man Little Fox had attacked. Grant needed no convincing. He landed one solid punch with his left hand, stunning his opponent, then scooped up the boy. "The root cellar!" Rebecca yelled, pointing to a trapdoor in the kitchen, hidden under a rug. It was their only escape. As Grant and the boy disappeared into the darkness below, Rebecca turned to face the fire and the two remaining men. The big man was trying to stomp out the flames, his shotgun momentarily forgotten. The other was staggering to his feet. Rebecca knew she had only seconds. She slid down the ladder, grabbed the fallen rifle, and aimed it at the big man. "Get out of my house," she snarled, the heat of the fire scorching her face. For a moment, the man stared at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Then the flames leaped higher, catching on the curtains. The fight was lost. Cursing, he grabbed his injured companion and dragged him toward the back door. "This ain't over," he bellowed over the roar of the fire. "Harrington will find you." Then they were gone, disappearing into the blizzard. Rebecca didn't wait. She scrambled toward the kitchen, coughing as thick smoke filled the cabin. She pulled the trap door shut just as a section of the roof began to groan. She and the boy and the stranger were safe, for now. But they were trapped in a dark hole, while her home, everything she had left of Joseph, burned to the ground above them. The roar of the fire was a physical presence, a deafening monster consuming her world. The darkness of the root cellar was absolute, broken only by the thin slivers of orange light that forced their way through the cracks in the trapdoor. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, earth, and fear. Rebecca could hear Little Fox's ragged breathing beside her and the strained, shallow breaths of the man named Grant. "Are you all right?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "I'm fine," Grant rasped, but a low groan that followed told her he was lying. "The boy?" "I'm here," a small voice said out of the darkness. It was quiet but clear. Rebecca was so startled she almost dropped the rifle. He hadn't spoken a single word since she'd found him. Now, in this tomb-like blackness, he spoke. "You were brave," she said, finding his small shoulder in the dark and giving it a squeeze. Above them, a massive crash shook the cellar as the main roof beam gave way. Dirt and embers rained down through the cracks. They were buried alive. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at Rebecca's throat. She fought it down. Panicking was a luxury she couldn't afford. Joseph had built this cellar to last. He'd told her there was a ventilation shaft, a narrow pipe that led to the surface behind the old smokehouse. It wasn't an exit, but it meant they wouldn't suffocate. For now, they were prisoners. "They mentioned a name," she said, forcing her mind to work, to focus on anything but the fire. "Harrington, a colonel." Grant shifted in the darkness. "Victor Harrington," he said, his voice grim. "He's the reason we're here. He's the one who wants the boy dead." The simple statement landed with the weight of a physical blow. This wasn't a random attack. It wasn't about robbery or a simple frontier grudge. This was an execution. "Why?" Rebecca demanded. "What did this boy see?" "A massacre," Grant said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Harrington's men, acting under his secret orders, wiped out Little Fox's entire village. 43 people, men, women, children, slaughtered. They made it look like the tribe had attacked a settlement first, but they hadn't. It was a lie to clear the land for the railroad." The horror of it settled over Rebecca. She had seen the brutality of war, but this was different. This was cold, calculated murder. Little Fox survived by hiding under his mother's body, Grant continued, his voice barely a whisper. He's the only one left, the only witness who can tie Harrington directly to the slaughter. So that was the secret, the terrible truth the boy carried in his silent heart. They weren't just running from nameless thugs. They were running from a powerful man, a colonel with railroad money, who would stop at nothing to bury his crimes. And now she was part of it. Her home was gone. She had nothing left but the clothes on her back, a rifle, and two strangers who had brought an army of monsters to her door. There's more, Grant said, his voice strained. You need to know. This isn't just about the boy. It's about your husband. Rebecca's blood ran cold. Joseph? What does he have to do with this? He knew, Grant said. Joseph was there. He wasn't part of the killing, but he witnessed the aftermath. He gathered evidence. Names, dates, copies of orders. He was building a case to expose Harrington. The world tilted on its axis. Joseph, her quiet, gentle Joseph, a secret crusader for justice? It seemed impossible. He had been troubled after the army, haunted by nightmares, but he'd never spoken of anything like this. The barn fire, Rebecca whispered, a dawning, terrible understanding, taking root in her soul. It wasn't an accident. No, Grant confirmed, his voice heavy with a grief that mirrored her own. It wasn't. They killed him to silence him, and they thought the evidence died with him. A floorboard directly above them creaked, not the groan of burning wood, but the deliberate weight of a boot. Someone was still up there, sifting through the ashes, making sure the job was done, and they were trapped right underneath them. The sound of the boot above them sent a fresh wave of terror through the cellar. They were rats in a trap, and the exterminator was walking on the ceiling. Rebecca held her breath, pressing herself and Little Fox against the cool, damp earth of the cellar wall. Grant had gone utterly still beside her, his pistol in his hand, its metal a cold, solid weight in the darkness. The footsteps moved slowly, crunching on charred wood and debris. A poker clanged against the stone as someone sifted through the remains of the hearth. They were looking for something, or someone. Were they looking for bodies? Did they think they'd killed them in the fire? Or did they know about the cellar? The thought was paralyzing. Joseph had been so proud of this hiding place, so sure of its secrecy. But Joseph was dead, and his secrets were dying with him. A low voice drifted down through the cracks, muffled and distorted by the earth and wood. Nothing here, just ash. Think they burned up? Another voice, harsher, answered. The colonel wants proof. Find the bodies, or find the tracks leading away. They can't have gone far in this storm. So they didn't know. Not for sure. That was something. A tiny sliver of hope in the suffocating darkness. Grant shifted, his movement so slight it was almost imperceptible. He leaned close to Rebecca's ear, his breath warm against her skin. There's a loose stone in the back wall, he whispered, his voice a mere thread of sound. Behind the shelf of preserves. Joseph showed me once. An emergency tunnel. Leads out to the old well. An emergency tunnel. Joseph had been a man of so many secrets. Rebecca's heart, which she thought had been shattered, ached with a fresh wave of love and loss. Even from the grave, he was trying to protect her. She nodded in the darkness, understanding. But how could they get to it without making a sound? The shelves were on the other side of the small cellar. They would have to crawl inch by inch, praying the men above didn't hear them. Grant went first. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator, his body low to the ground. Rebecca followed, pushing Little Fox ahead of her. The boy was preternaturally quiet, his small form navigating the uneven earthen floor without a single misstep. The sounds from above continued. The scrape of metal, the crunch of boots, the low murmur of frustrated voices. Every heartbeat in the cellar was a drumbeat of terror. They reached the back wall. Rebecca's hands fumbled in the dark, searching for the shelves of preserves, her own canned peaches and beans, a ghost of her former life. She found them, her fingers tracing the rough-hewn wood until they found the wall behind it. She felt along the stones, searching for one that was loose. It was Grant who found it. A faint click as he pressed on the right spot. A section of the stone wall, no bigger than a small door, swung inward with a low groan of protest. Cold, fresh air, smelling of snow and pine, washed over them. Freedom. But the tunnel was small, barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through, and the men were still right above them. Go, Grant urged in a whisper. Take the boy, I'll follow. No, Rebecca whispered back, her resolve hardening. You're injured. You and Little Fox go first. I have the rifle. I'll cover our escape if I have to. Before Grant could argue, a new sound from above froze them in place. A dog barking. A frantic, excited barking. It was coming closer. They've got a tracker, Grant breathed, the words laced with dread. It's over. He can smell us through the vent. The barking grew louder, more insistent, until it was directly over the hidden ventilation shaft. A man's voice shouted, Hey, over here! The dog's found something! The footsteps above quickened, converging on the spot. A shovel began to scrape at the snow and debris outside, digging for the source of the scent. They were moments from being discovered. Their tiny sliver of hope was gone, extinguished as quickly as it had appeared. The tunnel was their only chance, but it was a desperate one. They'd be exposed the moment they crawled out, right into the path of the men and their dog. It was a death trap. We go now. Grant's voice was a blade in the dark. There was no time for argument, no time for fear. He pushed Little Fox toward the narrow opening. Crawl, don't stop, don't look back. The boy scrambled into the tunnel without a sound, a small shadow swallowed by a deeper blackness. Rebecca, you're next, Grant ordered. She hesitated. What about you? I'm right behind you. I'll block the tunnel entrance. Buy us some time. Now go. She slung the rifle over her back and squeezed into the opening. The tunnel was tight, the cold, damp earth pressing in on all sides. It smelled of wet stone and roots. Behind her, she heard Grant grunting with effort as he pulled a heavy crate in front of the secret door. Ahead, she could just make out the shape of Little Fox, crawling with a desperate urgency. The sounds from the cellar were growing fainter, replaced by the frantic scrabbling of their own escape and the muffled sounds of the men digging outside. The tunnel was longer than she expected, a dark, suffocating birth canal leading from death to an uncertain life. It twisted and turned, forcing her to contort her body to fit through the narrow passages. The rifle on her back snagged on a root, and for a heart-stopping moment, she was stuck. Panic flared, hot and choking. She couldn't move. She was going to die here, buried in the earth. Then a small hand reached back from the darkness ahead, grabbing her own. Little Fox. He pulled, his small frame surprisingly strong. With a wrenching twist, she broke free, tearing her coat but getting loose. She could see a faint circle of gray light ahead. The exit. The old well. They scrambled toward it, their lungs burning, their bodies screaming with effort. Little Fox reached the end first, pushing aside a rotten wooden cover. He emerged into a swirl of snow and gray daylight. Rebecca was right behind him. They were out. They were standing in the ruins of the old smokehouse, a few dozen yards from the smoldering remains of her cabin. The air was frigid, filled with the acrid smell of wet smoke. In the distance, she could see the men, their backs to them, still digging frantically near the cellar's vent shaft. The dog was going wild, its barks echoing in the silent, snow-covered landscape. Grant emerged from the well, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his side bleeding freely through his torn shirt. He leaned against the well's stone wall, his breathing ragged. They haven't seen us, he gasped. The storm is covering our tracks. He was right. The snow was coming down harder now, a thick, wet curtain that muffled sound and obscured sight. It was a gift, a chance. We have to move, Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. The horses, they're still in the new barn. If they haven't been found, it was a slim hope. The new barn was on the other side of the property, but it was their only hope of escape. They won't expect us to double back, Grant said, thinking along the same lines. They'll assume we ran for the woods. He pushed himself off the wall, his jaw set with determination. Let's go. They moved like ghosts through the swirling snow, using the trees and the ruins of the old fences for cover. Every step was a risk. A snapped twig, a misplaced footstep could alert the dog and bring the entire pack down on them. They reached the edge of the clearing where the new barn stood, a dark, silent shape against the white landscape. There were no tracks around it, no sign the men had been there. Hope, fierce and bright, surged in Rebecca's chest. Her two horses, her last living link to Joseph, were inside. They might actually make it. They slipped inside the barn. The familiar smell of hay and horse was a comfort, a memory of a simpler, safer time. Her two geldings nickered softly at her approach. They were safe. Grant leaned heavily against a stall, a wave of dizziness washing over him. The escape had taken its toll. His wound had reopened, and a fresh patch of crimson was spreading across his bandage. "We need to go," he urged, though his body was clearly failing him. "They'll search here next." Rebecca worked quickly, her hands sure and practiced as she threw saddles on the horses. There was no time for bridles, just a rope halter for steering. She helped Grant onto one horse, his body slumping in the saddle. She swung herself onto the other, pulling Little Fox up to sit in front of her. The boy wrapped his small arms around her waist, his body a small, solid anchor in the chaos. She took a deep breath, ready to burst from the barn and ride for their lives. But as she gathered the reins, her eyes fell on something in the corner of the barn, half hidden under a pile of old burlap sacks. It was Grant's saddlebag, the one she'd searched that first night, the one he'd been so desperate to keep with him. On a hunch, she slid off the horse and hurried over to it. It felt heavier than she remembered. She unbuckled the straps and reached inside. Her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. She pulled it out. It wasn't ammunition. It wasn't a weapon. It was a stack of tin-type photographs, bound together with a leather strap. The one on top was the one she'd seen before. Grant and Joseph, young and smiling in their union blue. She flipped to the next one. It was Joseph and her, on their wedding day. The next was a picture of a woman she didn't recognize holding a baby. On the back, an inscription, "My Sarah and Samuel," Grant's wife and son. And then she saw the last one. Her blood turned to ice. It was a photograph of Colonel Victor Harrington. And standing beside him, smiling, was Grant. They were wearing matching uniforms, not of the Army, but of a private security force, the Central Montana Railway Police. Grant wasn't just a former Army scout. He worked for the enemy. He had lied about everything. The photograph felt like a brand in her hand. Grant, Harrington, together, smiling. The man who had saved her life, who had protected the boy, was one of them. The world fractured, the last 2 days rearranging themselves into a new, horrific picture. The ambush, the pursuit, his convenient arrival at her cabin. Was it all a lie? A setup? Had he led them here? Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She looked over at him, slumped on the horse, his face pale with pain and exhaustion. Was it an act? "Who are you?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Grant's eyes opened. He saw the photograph in her hand and the betrayal on her face. A look of profound weariness settled over him, a deep, soul-crushing exhaustion that had nothing to do with his wound. "It's not what you think, Rebecca," he said, his voice low and ragged. "I can explain." "Explain what?" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "Explain why you have a picture of yourself with the man who murdered my husband? The man who wants to murder this child?" Little Fox looked from her face to Grant's, his own expression a mixture of fear and confusion. "I used to work for him," Grant admitted, his gaze not leaving hers. "Before the massacre, I was chief of his railway security. I thought we were protecting the line, keeping the peace. I didn't know what he was, not until it was too late." He coughed, a raw, wet sound. "Joseph and we served together in the war. He was the one who got me the job with Harrington. He thought it was a good opportunity. We both did." The story sounded plausible. Desperately, she wanted to believe it. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were taking root. "The massacre," Grant continued, his voice dropping. "I wasn't there. I was 100 miles away on Harrington's orders, A wild goose chase. He sent me away on purpose. But Joseph saw it, and he came to me. He showed me the proof. He told me what Harrington had done. He paused, his breath catching. That's when I quit. When I knew what kind of monster he was. The photograph. It's from before. It's the only picture I have of my wife and son. They died of fever the year before. It's all I have left. His voice was raw with a grief so profound, it seemed to suck the air from the barn. Rebecca looked at the picture again. The woman, Sarah, the baby, Samuel. Then she looked at Grant's face, the lines of pain and loss etched so deeply they seemed a part of him, and she saw the truth. It was a truth more complicated and painful than a simple betrayal. He wasn't the enemy. He was a man trapped, just like her, a man who had lost everything to Victor Harrington. The barn door creaked open. One of Harrington's men stood there, a pistol in his hand, a look of triumph on his face. Well, well, look what we have here. He hadn't seen the photograph. He just saw them, trapped. He raised his pistol, aiming it squarely at Grant. The colonel will be pleased. Rebecca didn't think. She acted. She threw the stack of photographs at the man's face. The unexpected missile caught him by surprise. He flinched, batting them away. In that split second of distraction, Rebecca raised her rifle and fired. The shot was deafening. The man stumbled back, a dark stain spreading across his chest, his eyes wide with shock. He fell, his pistol clattering on the floor. But the damage was done. The gunshot was a signal. It would bring the others running. Go! Grant yelled, kicking his horse into motion. Ride! North! Follow the creek! Rebecca scrambled back onto her horse, pulling Little Fox tight against her. They burst out of the barn, the two horses thundering across the snow-covered clearing. Behind them, shouts and more gunshots erupted from the smoldering ruins of the cabin. They were exposed. A perfect target. A bullet whizzed past Rebecca's ear, so close she felt its heat. She urged her horse faster, leaning low over its neck, shielding Little Fox with her own body. They plunged into the trees that lined the creek, the branches whipping at their faces. The snow was deeper here, slowing the horses, but the trees offered cover. They were alive. They had escaped. But now they were fugitives in the heart of a blizzard, with a wounded man, a traumatized child, and a powerful enemy who would never ever stop hunting them. And she had just killed a man. The woman she was yesterday was gone, burned away in the ashes of her home. A new woman, harder, fiercer, had been forged in the fire, and she was just beginning to fight. The blizzard was a churning vortex of white, a relentless assault of wind and snow that clawed at them, seeking to pull them from their saddles and bury them in its frozen embrace. Rebecca rode with her head down, the world reduced to the straining back of her horse, the small, shivering body of Little Fox pressed against her, and the dark shape of Grant riding just ahead, a ghost in the maelstrom. The creek was their guide, a barely visible slash of darker gray in the universal white. Grant had been right. The running water and the falling snow would cover their tracks, but it was a treacherous path. The horses slipped on hidden ice, stumbled in deep drifts, their breath coming in ragged, steaming bursts. They rode for what felt like hours, the silence between them broken only by the howling of the wind and the labored breathing of the horses. Rebecca's mind was a maelstrom of its own. She had killed a man. The reality of it was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. It wasn't like the war, where death was an abstract, distant thing. This was close, personal. She had looked into his eyes as he fell, but what choice did she have? It was him or them. Her, Grant, Little Fox, this strange, broken little family she had somehow acquired. Grant swayed in his saddle, his body a dead weight. He was losing too much blood. If they didn't find shelter soon, the cold and his wounds would kill him. "We have to stop!" she yelled over the wind. "He needs help!" Grant turned, his face barely visible through the curtain of snow. He shook his head. "Keep going. They'll be right behind us." "They won't find us in this," she screamed back. "We'll die out here if we don't stop." Little Fox tugged on her sleeve, his small voice nearly lost in the wind. "Cave, he said, pointing to a dark outcropping of rock on the steep bank of the creek. There. It was barely visible, a shadow within a shadow, but it was there. A small opening, a potential sanctuary. Rebecca didn't wait for Grant's approval. She guided her horse toward the bank, sliding and stumbling down the slick, snowy incline. The cave was small and shallow, more of an overhang than a true cavern, but it offered a respite from the wind's relentless assault. She slid off her horse, her legs numb and clumsy, and helped Little Fox down. Grant practically fell from his saddle, collapsing onto the frozen ground. His face was as white as the snow around them. "Help me get him inside," she said to Little Fox. Together, the woman and the boy dragged the nearly unconscious man into the relative shelter of the cave. His side was soaked in blood, a terrifying dark stain against the white snow. Rebecca tore a strip from her petticoat, her hands clumsy with cold, and pressed it against the wound. It was a deep gash, a bullet graze that had torn through muscle. He was lucky to be alive. "Fire," she said, her teeth chattering. "We need a fire." They gathered what dry wood they could find under the overhang, their fingers so numb they could barely grip the brittle branches. With trembling hands, Rebecca used the flint and steel from her saddlebag. The sparks refused to catch. The tinder was too damp. Despair, cold and bitter, began to creep in. They had escaped only to freeze to death in a hole in the ground. Then Little Fox knelt beside her. He took a small pouch from around his neck. Inside was a piece of dried fungus and a perfectly preserved cattail head. He shredded the fluff from the cattail, creating a small dry nest, and showed her how to strike the flint so the spark fell directly into it. A tiny ember glowed, a fragile spark of hope. He blew on it gently, expertly, until a small, steady flame erupted. Soon, a small but determined fire was crackling in the mouth of the cave, its warmth a blessing beyond measure. Rebecca looked at the boy, his face illuminated by the flickering light. He was no longer just a victim. He was a survivor. He possessed a knowledge of this land, of its secrets that she could only marvel at. He was not a burden. He was their key to survival. As she tended to Grant's wounds, cleaning them with snow and bandaging them with more strips of her clothing, he drifted back to consciousness. His blue eyes found hers in the firelight. "Joseph," he murmured, his voice weak. "He talked about you, said you were the strongest person he knew, said you had more spine than a whole company of soldiers." The words, a message from her dead husband, brought tears to her eyes. "He overestimated me," she whispered. "No," Grant said, his hand finding hers, his grip surprisingly strong. "He didn't." He coughed, a racking, painful sound. "There's a journal. Joseph's journal. It has everything. The names, the dates, the proof." He hid it. His eyes were intense, urgent. He said, "He said you would know where. The badge holds the key." A badge? A key? It made no sense. It was the delirious rambling of a wounded man, but the urgency in his eyes told her it was important. "Where, Grant? Where is the journal?" But his eyes had closed again, his strength gone. He had slipped back into unconsciousness, leaving her with a riddle, a dying fire, and the vast, unforgiving wilderness closing in around them. "The badge holds the key." The words echoed in her mind, a nonsensical refrain in the howling song of the storm. The blizzard raged for 2 days. They were prisoners in the small cave. Their world shrunk to the flickering circle of firelight, the shivering horses huddled at the entrance, and the slow, ragged breathing of the man who held the key to her husband's secrets. Rebecca rationed their meager supplies, a handful of oats for the horses, the last of the jerky for them. Grant drifted in and out of a fevered delirium, murmuring names she didn't know. Sarah, Samuel, and one she knew all too well. Joseph. In his clearer moments, he spoke of the journal, his words fragmented and urgent. He kept it all, proof that could hang a man like Harrington. "You have to find it, Rebecca. For Joseph. For the boy." Little Fox was her silent, steady partner in survival. He showed her how to melt snow for water without making it taste of smoke. He found edible roots buried beneath the snow near the creek bank. He sat for hours watching Grant, his small face a mask of solemn concern. On the third morning, they woke to an eerie silence. The storm had passed. A weak, watery sun filtered through the trees, making the fresh fallen snow glitter with a light so bright it hurt the eyes. The world was transformed, buried under a thick blanket of pristine white. It was beautiful, and it was a death sentence. Their tracks were gone, but so was any sign of a trail, any landmark that could guide them. They were lost. Grant was weaker than ever, the fever still burning in him, but he was lucid. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "They'll be searching again, wider this time." "Where do we go?" Rebecca asked. "Eleanor's," he said. "Your neighbor. It's the closest place, maybe 5 miles east of here." Eleanor Whitman, a widow in her 60s, sharp-tongued and nosy, but with a core of kindness. She had been fond of Joseph. Could they trust her with a secret this deadly? They had no choice. It took all of Rebecca's strength to get Grant onto his horse. He was a dead weight, barely able to hold on. She led his horse with Little Fox riding her own, acting as a scout. The boy was their compass. He pointed out the direction of the rising sun, the way the moss grew on the trees, small signs that told him which way was east. They moved slowly, a funereal procession through a silent, white world. The beauty of the landscape was mocked by the urgency of their flight. Every snap of a twig, every call of a bird sent a jolt of fear through Rebecca. Were they being watched? Were Harrington's men closing in? They had been traveling for hours when Little Fox suddenly held up his hand, signaling for a halt. He slid off the horse and crept forward, peering through a thicket of pines. Rebecca joined him, her rifle ready. Below them, in a small clearing, was a cabin, not Eleanor's. This one was smaller, cruder, and from its chimney a thin plume of smoke curled into the cold air. Someone was home. A lone rider's tracks led to the cabin door. Trappers, maybe? Or worse? "We should go around," Rebecca whispered. But as she spoke, the cabin door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall and dressed in the black coat of a clergyman. Reverend Palmer, the town preacher, a man known for his fiery sermons about the savagery of the natives and the moral decay of the frontier. He had officiated Joseph's funeral, his words of comfort feeling hollow and cold. What was he doing out here, so far from town? Palmer stretched, then turned his gaze directly toward the thicket where they were hiding. It was as if he knew they were there. He raised a hand, not in greeting, but as a signal. From the woods behind the cabin, 3 men emerged. They were the same men who had attacked her. The man with the injured leg, the one who had his head bashed by her trunk, and their massive bearded leader. The Reverend was working with them. He was part of it. The trap was closing, and they had walked right into it. The betrayal was a physical shock, a punch to the gut that left Rebecca breathless. The church, the law, the pillars of this small frontier community, they were all rotten, all in Harrington's pocket. The Reverend Palmer wasn't a man of God. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing. He turned and spoke to the men, his voice carrying on the still cold air. "They'll be heading for the Whitman place. It's the only shelter for miles. We'll cut them off at the ridge." The big man nodded. "You sure they survived the storm, Reverend?" "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Palmer said, a thin, cruel smile on his lips. "But I have faith that our prayers will be answered. The colonel is a generous man, and he wants this loose end tied up." They mounted their horses, their movements confident, certain. They thought they had them. They didn't know their prey was watching, listening. Grant had slid from his horse and crawled up beside Rebecca. He had heard everything. His face was a grim mask. "We can't get to Eleanor's," he whispered. "They'll be waiting." "We have to warn her," Rebecca insisted. "If they think she's helping us, they'll—" She couldn't finish the thought. Eleanor was her friend. "We can't," Grant said, his voice firm. "We'd be leading them right to her. Our only chance is to draw them away. Make them follow us." He looked at the terrain, his scout's eyes assessing every ridge, every shadow. "The river. We follow the creek north until it joins the Blackfoot River. It's rough country. Box canyons, rapids. They won't expect us to go that way, especially not with me in this condition." It was a desperate plan, a suicidal plan, but it was the only one they had. As Palmer and his men rode south to intercept them at the ridge, Rebecca, Grant, and Little Fox slipped away, heading in the opposite direction, deeper into the unforgiving heart of the Montana wilderness. The journey was a nightmare. The terrain grew more rugged, the creek carving a deeper and deeper gorge into the land. They had to dismount and lead the horses, scrambling over slick rocks and through icy water that numbed their feet. Grant grew weaker with every step. His fever was back, and he was beginning to hallucinate, muttering about battles Rebecca had never heard of. Several times he stumbled and fell, and it took both Rebecca and Little Fox to get him back on his feet. The boy was their rock. He never complained. He found paths that Rebecca would have missed. He seemed to draw strength from the harshness of the land, a strength his ancestors had passed down to him. By nightfall, they were trapped in a narrow canyon, the walls rising up on either side like stone giants. The river, which had been a shallow creek, was now a churning, angry torrent of black water and ice flows. They were exhausted, freezing, and their food was almost gone. Grant collapsed by the fire they managed to build, his body racked with shivers. He was dying. Rebecca knew it. She had seen enough men die to recognize the signs. "The badge," he rasped, his eyes glassy with fever. He reached into his coat and pulled out a tarnished silver star. A sheriff's badge. Joseph found it at the massacre. The man who wore it was one of Harrington's. He was supposed to make it all look legal. He pressed the badge into her hand. It was heavy, cold. "On the back," he coughed. "A code." Rebecca turned it over. Scratched into the metal were a series of numbers, 42 to 17-8. "It's the key," Grant whispered, his voice fading. "The key to the journal. Joseph. He said you would understand." And then, in a flash of memory, she did. It wasn't a code for a safe. It was a game she and Joseph used to play. A book cipher. He'd give her 3 numbers, page, line, word. It was a secret language just for them. 42 to 17-8. But which book? Their Bible? A volume of Shakespeare? Her mind raced through the small collection of books she had owned, now reduced to ash. Then she remembered the one book Joseph treasured above all others, the one he always kept on his workbench in the barn, a well-worn copy of Thoreau's Walden, a book about solitude, nature, and hidden truths. The barn, she breathed. The journal wasn't in the house. It was in the barn. The new barn, hidden somewhere only she would know how to find. A wave of despair washed over her. The barn was miles away, back at her destroyed homestead, surrounded by killers. It was an impossible journey. But as she looked at Grant's fading life, at Little Fox's trusting face, she knew she had to try. She had to go back into the heart of the danger. It was what Joseph would have wanted. It was the only way to finish what he had started. Leaving Grant was the hardest thing Rebecca had ever done. He was too weak to travel, his life hanging by a thread. "I'll watch him," Little Fox said, his voice quiet but firm. "I know the plants that fight fever. He will be safe." Rebecca looked at the boy, this child who had endured so much, now offering to be a caregiver, a protector. She saw in his dark, serious eyes a wisdom far beyond his years. She knew she could trust him. She left them with 1 horse, the rifle, and most of the remaining supplies. She took the faster gelding, a pistol, and a small pouch of parched corn. She would travel light and fast. "If I'm not back in 3 days," she told Little Fox, "take the horse and ride north. Find a fort. Find anyone who will listen." The boy simply nodded, his gaze steady. "You will be back." His certainty was a small, warm coal in the freezing landscape of her fear. Riding back was a surreal experience. She was a ghost haunting the landscape of her own life. She avoided the paths they had taken, sticking to the high ridges, moving through the trees like a shadow. She saw signs of her pursuers everywhere. Tracks, a hastily abandoned campsite, the carcass of a deer they had killed. They were searching, sweeping the territory, confident that their prey was trapped and running scared. They would never expect her to be riding toward them. She traveled by night and hid by day, sleeping in short, fitful bursts in thickets of pine, the horse tethered nearby. The cold was a constant, gnawing enemy. The silence of the wilderness was a vast, empty canvas on which her fears painted terrifying pictures. On the second night, she crested the ridge overlooking her own land. The sight stole her breath. The cabin was a blackened skeleton, a jagged wound in the snow. But the new barn was still standing. A faint light glowed in its windows. They were there, using her home as their base of operations. Anger, hot and pure, burned through her fear. They had taken everything from her. Now they were squatting in her last remaining sanctuary, like vultures on a corpse. She waited until the deepest point of the night, when the moon was hidden by clouds, and the world was plunged into an inky blackness. She left the horse tethered in the woods and crept forward on foot, a phantom in the snow. She circled the barn, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could hear the low murmur of voices inside, the snort of their horses. A single guard was posted at the main door, his silhouette a dark shape against the lantern light from within. He was stamping his feet to keep warm, his breath pluming in the air. Rebecca crept to the back of the barn, to a small loose board near the foundation that Joseph had never gotten around to fixing. It was a flaw, an oversight. Now it was her way in. She wriggled through the opening, scraping her hands and knees, but she was inside. The barn smelled of their horses, of stale tobacco and whiskey. 4 of them were inside, playing cards by the light of a lantern. The guard at the door made 5. She could see the Reverend Palmer, his black coat draped over a bale of hay, sleeping near the warmth of a small stove. She moved like smoke through the shadows, her moccasins making no sound on the straw-covered floor. Joseph's workbench was against the far wall. It was just as she remembered it, meticulously organized even now. The copy of Walden was there, tucked behind a row of neatly cleaned tools. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Page 42, line 17. Word 8. She counted carefully, her finger tracing the words in the dim light. The word was foundation. The foundation. Of course. Joseph had always been a practical, literal man. She looked at the floor around the workbench. The heavy wooden planks were solid, immovable. But Joseph had been a master carpenter. He loved secret compartments, clever designs. She ran her hands along the base of the workbench itself. And there it was, a small, almost invisible seam in the wood. She pressed, and a section of the bench's solid foundation swung open, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a slim leather-bound journal. Joseph's journal. She had it. Relief so powerful it almost made her weak, washed over her. She tucked the journal inside her coat, her mission complete. Now she just had to get out. She began to back away, melting back into the shadows. But as she turned, her foot caught on a stray piece of harness. It clattered loudly on the wooden floor. The card game stopped. 4 heads snapped up, their eyes peering into the darkness where she stood. "Who's there?" One of them growled, reaching for his gun. She was caught. There was no escape. The game was up. But as the men started to rise, a new sound cut through the tension. A high, piercing whistle from outside. The guard at the door shouted, "Riders coming!" The men in the barn exchanged confused glances. They weren't expecting anyone. Rebecca used the moment of confusion. She didn't run for the back wall. She ran for the main door. She burst past the startled guard, a fleeting shadow in the night, and sprinted for the tree line where she had left her horse. Behind her, chaos erupted. Shouts, curses, the thunder of hoofbeats as the mysterious riders galloped into the clearing. Gunshots exploded in the night. She didn't look back. She didn't know who the riders were, allies or a new enemy. All she knew was that they had given her a chance. She reached her horse, swung herself into the saddle, and rode like the devil was chasing her. And for all she knew, he was. The journal was a hard, solid reality against her ribs, a final message from her husband, a testament of truth in a world of lies. She had the key. Now she just had to survive long enough to use it. The ride back to the canyon was a desperate, frantic race against time and the rising sun. The mysterious riders had thrown Harrington's men into chaos, but Rebecca knew the confusion wouldn't last. They would regroup. They would find her trail. She pushed the gelding to its limits, the horse's powerful legs eating up the miles, its breath coming in great white plumes. She arrived back at the canyon as the first rays of dawn were painting the eastern sky. She found them huddled by the dying embers of the fire. Grant was conscious, his fever broken. Little Fox was asleep, his head resting on Grant's good shoulder. "The herbs," Grant whispered as she approached. "The boy. He's a healer. He saved my life." Rebecca knelt and opened her coat, revealing the journal. Grant's eyes widened. "You did it," he breathed, a look of awe on his face. "How?" "I had help," she said, still unsure of who her mysterious saviors were. "We have to go. Now. They'll be coming." The journal was a revelation. Joseph's neat, precise handwriting filled the pages, a meticulous record of Harrington's crimes. He detailed the massacre, listing the names of the officers involved. He had financial records, copied by a brave clerk in Helena, that linked Harrington directly to the railroad's acquisition of the Apache land. He had witness statements from soldiers who were horrified by what they had been ordered to do. And the final entry, dated the day before he died, was a chilling premonition. H knows. Contact in Helena found dead. He's cleaning house. I fear they are coming for me next. I have hidden this record. If anything happens, Rebecca will know where to look. The foundation of our life holds the truth. "We have enough," Grant said, his voice stronger now, filled with a renewed sense of purpose. "This is enough to hang him. We have to get it to Helena, to the territorial governor." Helena was 100 miles away, a near impossible journey in their condition. But as they read Joseph's words, the testament of his courage, they knew they had to try. They traveled for a week, a desperate trek through the brutal Montana winter. They were hunted, hungry, and half frozen, but they were driven by a single purpose: justice. Little Fox was their guide, their hunter, their healer. He led them through secret game trails, taught them which barks and roots to eat, and tended to Grant's wound with a skill that defied his age. Grant, weak but resolute, was their protector, his military training and knowledge of their enemy keeping them one step ahead of the pursuit. And Rebecca was their heart, their leader, her grief transformed into an unbending resolve. The journal was her shield and her sword. They saw their pursuers several times, dark figures on a distant ridge, a glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel. Each time, they managed to slip away, a combination of Little Fox's wilderness skills and Grant's tactical cunning saving them from discovery. They finally reached the outskirts of Helena, a rough and tumble city of miners, merchants, and politicians. They were a ragged, desperate-looking trio, but they had made it. They found the governor's office, a grand stone building that seemed out of place in the muddy streets of the frontier town. They were stopped at the door by armed guards. "The governor is a busy man," one of them said, looking them up and down with disdain. "He doesn't have time for drifters." "We have evidence of a massacre," Rebecca said, her voice clear and strong, "committed by Colonel Victor Harrington." The guard's expression flickered. He shared a look with his partner. "Wait here." Minutes later, they were ushered into a lavish office. Governor Potts was a large, florid man with a politician's easy smile, but his eyes were shrewd and calculating. Standing beside his desk, looking perfectly at ease, was Colonel Harrington. The trap hadn't been on the trail. It was here, at the end. The governor himself was in on it. "Mrs. Morgan," Harrington said, his voice smooth as silk, but with an underlying menace that was terrifying. "What a pleasure. I've been so worried about you. My men told me you were abducted by this deserter," he gestured at Grant, "and that you had tragically lost your mind with grief." It was a perfect story, a grieving widow manipulated by a dangerous criminal. Who would believe her word against a decorated colonel and a territorial governor? "And the poor Apache boy," Harrington continued, his eyes landing on Little Fox. "We've been so desperate to return him to his people." He smiled, and Rebecca saw the monster beneath the mask. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," he said, holding out his hand. "A journal." All hope seemed to drain away. They were surrounded, outmaneuvered. The law itself was their enemy. But Rebecca looked at Little Fox, who stood tall and unafraid. She looked at Grant, who met Harrington's gaze with a look of pure hatred. And she looked at the journal in her hands, the last piece of her husband. She would not let him have it. She would not let him win. "No," she said. She opened the journal, Not to the beginning, but to the middle pages, where Joseph had taped the copied financial records. "I believe this belongs to the people of Montana," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. She began to read. She read the names of the dead. She read the dates of the illegal land transfers. She read the amounts of the bribes paid to politicians. Her voice was the only sound in the room. The governor's face had gone pale. Harrington's smile had vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. As she read, the office door opened. But it wasn't more of Harrington's men. It was a dozen uniformed soldiers of the U.S. Army, and leading them was a grizzled, one-armed general. "Colonel Harrington," the general said, his voice like gravel, "you are under arrest for murder, treason, and conspiracy against the United States government." Harrington stared, dumbfounded. "On whose authority?" The general smiled grimly. "The highest authority. We received a telegram from a very brave boy." He nodded toward the back of the room, and from the shadows two figures emerged, the riders who had saved her at the barn. They were not Harrington's men. They were two Apache warriors, scouts for the army. They had been tracking Little Fox, not to harm him, but to protect him. They were the ones who had sent word to the general, a man Joseph had served under, a man known for his integrity. Justice had come, not from the corrupt politicians, but from the very people Harrington had tried to destroy. As Harrington and the governor were led away in chains, the general turned to Rebecca. "Your husband was a good man, Mrs. Morgan, a true patriot. He would be proud of you." Tears streamed down Rebecca's face, tears of grief, of relief, of victory. She looked at Grant, who was leaning against a chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. She looked at Little Fox, who took her hand, his eyes shining. Her old life was gone, burned to ashes. But from those ashes, something new was rising. A new purpose, a new future, a new family forged in fire and ice. They had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and they had not been defeated. Their journey was over, but their story was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the edge of the unknown. You never know what secrets are buried just waiting to be uncovered.